Hi, I'm Jennifer Cohn, and I'm here today with David Pepper, who is the chairman of the Ohio Democratic Party and an author. Hi, David. Nice to meet you in
Hey,
person or
yeah,
over video.
good to see you in person. How you doing? Okay,
Yeah,
out there, okay?
I'm doing okay. It's actually, we're getting into summer in Northern California, which means it's really foggy.
Uh,
How,
my
how are
brother
you?
lives out there. He tells me the same thing. So,
Oh, is that right?
yep.
So, I wanted to thank you for sending me a copy of your most recent book, which I devoured, like I devoured all of your books. You've written three, and before I talk about those, I wanted to get just a little bit into your background because it's really interesting and how you came to write these books, and then I'd like to talk about the books and some sort of related concepts
Hmm.
because the books do touch on my issue that I have been so concerned with since the 2016 election, which is election interference. And your
Right,
books are, yeah, they're technically fiction, but they're realistic fiction in that they address real vulnerabilities and sort of what could happen.
right.
Do you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah, they're sort of the worst case scenarios, but as you know from the first one, a lot of what I wrote about before 16 ended up being kind of close to what did happen.
Right. That do you want to explain that? It's so remarkable. If you want to just actually, well, let's get into your background first,
Okay,
just really
yeah,
quickly.
sure.
So,
Sure.
how did you're the chair of the Ohio Democratic Party? I know that you ran for a few offices before that, and you're an attorney. Can you just explain briefly your background?
Sure. So I have kind of a background that went in different directions. I born and raised in Cincinnati, where I sit now in this very small, unexciting office since we have a pandemic. I went to
Yeah.
school out east. I actually one interesting part of my life that ended up being part of these books, but also coincidentally led to some relevance. Is I worked in Russia for 3 years
Oh,
while
I
I
didn't know that. Wow.
college.
Okay.
And so, if you in my books, I always have these Russian antagonists. I didn't do that because I was trying to predict Putin's behavior. I did it because I worked in Russia in the early to mid 90s. I did, in fact, meet with Vladimir Putin a number of times because he was the vice mayor of St. Petersburg, and that's where my work was. So I did that. Then I went back to law school. After law school, I returned to Cincinnati. I clerked for the Sixth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. And then after that, I actually ran for city council. I won that race. I was a city council member for several terms. I was a county commissioner here in Hamilton County. And then, as you mentioned, I ran statewide in 2010 and 2014. And that was for me the first time I really started confronting one issue. You know, as passionate as you are about protecting elections, and I am as well, I am incredibly passionate, as you can tell from my books, about the need to end gerrymandering. To me, gerrymandering is the
Yes.
poison of that and dark money and efforts to suppress votes in all sorts of different ways. Those are the three poisons of politics right now. Now, gerrymandering, I think, is the one that is the most easy to fix because of this current cycle and court cases that have gone in our favor. So all of that, I lost the two races I ran for statewide. I ran for state auditor in 2010 when Ted Strickland ultimately lost to John Kasich. I ran for attorney general in 2014. So one lesson in my life, running in the midterm when you have the presidency is not a good idea. Those were tough years to run.
Right.
But
Because they
but I
like to
also,
balance, the
but that
public likes to
also,
balance out. Go
yeah,
ahead.
but it also opened up my eyes to a lot of the bigger political issues beyond what I dealt with. And I was so frustrated in 2010 that we all know now in hindsight, Republicans had this entire strategy called Red Map, which was
Hmm.
to go win these state legislatures and these other positions that draw the lines. They did, and they gerrymandered out of the country. We are stuck in Ohio with the worst gerrymandered map in our history. So are other states. That all happened in 2010. When I ran, I was running around. Democrats didn't even know what I was talking about when I said, if I win the state auditor position, I can stop gerrymandering. People just,
No one knew what it meant.
yeah, we weren't tuned in. Now, the bigger players were, but the average person
Right.
did not know just how horrible gerrymandering is, how undemocratic it is, how much it's ruined so much of basic democracy. And so when I was done, and then after a failed effort to change Ohio's constitution to end gerrymandering, out of frustration, I said, you know what? I'm going to write a book about it. But I'm not going to write a nonfiction book because the only people who will read that book are the ones who already know about gerrymandering. I'm going to
Sure.
write a novel about gerrymandering. Now, the problem is That's the worst novel idea ever. So
Yeah, really boring.
it doesn't sound exciting. So from the first book that I put into the novel, hopefully an exciting plot where
It was incredible.
A Russian, and I can imagine Putin thinking this way, literally looks at gerrymandering in America and says, "Wait a second, that's how you pick your legislatures? What a terrible system!" And so the plot in the first book is all about someone wants to someone needs a shortcut on regulations to build pipelines, and they can't get it done the right way. So this Russian oligarch decides, well, I'm just gonna mess with some voting machines in the handful of swing districts in the country that matter. And because of gerrymandering, everyone knows which districts those are. And lo and behold, he gets his outcome by rigging those machines. So it was my frustration that got me writing a novel. And then, to be clear, my Russian oligarch meddling story, I wrote that somewhere around 2013. So wow. I wasn't trying to predict what happened. I was trying to actually take, this need to talk about gerrymandering and put it into an exciting story. But I will say, whether it was the way that they rigged the machines or gerrymandering, my goal, and this gets into why my books end up being, I think, prescient, my goal is always to capture the reality of politics. And so the key in the first book to the rigging of the votes was by creating a situation where votes were just tossed out. And we never study, why do people undervote as they go down a ballot? And they did it on a machine that, these machines better than I do. They did it on a machine where you have that little paper trail that you can look at.
It's called a voter verifiable paper audit trail.
Exactly. And guess what? No one ever looks at the receipt. So
how did you find that out? Did you do some research? Like if I wanted to hack voting? Okay.
Yeah, I did some research, and the truth is, it doesn't take a lot of research to find the studies that only 10% of voters ever look at that receipt to verify that the receipt reflects how they voted. So it's 10%. And so in my book, using that real research, I basically had the machine would actually change the receipt. And if the voter didn't correct it, the machine recording would then reflect the changed receipt, and no one would know the better. Now, what's funny is I actually sent my book before it was ever published in mid-16. I sent it to the professor who did that study. And he
was that Halderman, or who was it?
This is a guy named Daniel Takagi at Ohio State. He's he does a lot of voting rights work, but he also had done the study. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is he said, I really like your book, David, but I'm scared it made it look so easy to hack. And I said, I was just using your study. And he said, I know. But so the point of my books is I tried, in the end, after the first one was successful, my goal has been to always be a story that tells, hopefully an exciting fiction novel. My main character is a newspaper reporter who's always digging up scandal. But I've also tried to have it be very focused on the reality of politics, so people feel like, especially at a time like this, they're not just reading a book for pleasure, they're actually learning a lot about politics too. So I've always tried to
I've learned a lot.
Happen.
I've learned a lot from reading them. Something that really struck me on your most recent one, the third one, and it has to do with gerrymandering, is, I'd heard a lot of people talk about the census, and the census is so important, and they can hack the census, and they can hack the but no one is really very few people actually say that it's relevant to gerrymandering. And I'm wondering, actually, if you could just give a soundbite on what gerrymandering is, just in case some people don't know what it is, and 2, why the census affects it, and 3, why it matters. I can remind you of the 1, 2, 3, but why it matters so much this year, 2020.
Sure. I mean, this is the year. 2020 is, and part of the message of this book is, yes, this is the year where we in Ohio and across the country want to get rid of Donald Trump. But just like 2010 set the table for 10 years of rigged legislative elections, gerrymandering is rigging the map to guarantee the outcome of elections. That's what it is. And that's what we've been stuck with in this country for a decade. Oh, here's an example. Ohio in 2018, 52% of Ohioans voted for a Republican for the House, 48% voted for a Democrat. What was the result of the legislative breakdown? 12-4, guaranteed. Almost no race was even close.
Wow.
State House, 50% of Ohioans voted for Republican. 49% voted for Democrat. What's the breakdown of the legislature? Mid-60s to mid-30s. It's a rigged legislative election. You and I could have looked at the map, except for one slight change over time. We could have looked at the map in 2012, and you and I could have figured out the result of every single election for the coming decade. That's
Jesus
how
Christ.
bad it is.
And that's going to happen. That's going to happen again right now.
2020 is the year where it happens again. So one of the take-home parts of this book, I hope, is that people, yes, we're going to get rid of Donald Trump, but vote your way through that ballot. Get to the state rep races, because state reps are in most states still the ones agreeing on the maps. Go vote for your state Supreme Court races. Though with the Supreme Court of the United States last year saying we're not going to deal with gerrymander cases, which they said it is going to fall on your state Supreme Courts who will rule on these maps in Ohio in 2021. What we have found in the country in the last couple of years, if you get a fair, nonpartisan court, like Pennsylvania's 2 years ago, that will end gerrymandering that state. So in Ohio right now, we have 2 Democrats running to take the court 4-3. And I think if we win those races, there will be a bipartisan majority, both the Republican Chief Justice and Democrats, who will strike down any effort to rig Ohio's map for another decade. So one key theme of the book is, yes, the presidential race is important, but as my main character says at one point in the voter file, he says, when he figures out that the plot is about the drawing of the maps, he says, as you may remember, oh no, this isn't about the presidency, it's bigger.
Right. Yes, that was a great line. And his name's Jack Sharp, just so people know.
Jack Sharp is my down and out Youngstown vindicated reporter who's living the life of a journalist, frankly, in today's world of the ever shrinking local paper. And he doesn't go into these stories looking for these big stories, but he keeps finding them. In this case, it's a Wisconsin Supreme Court race. It seems a little strange. And he starts looking into it. It is strange, but in the end, I don't want to give away the whole book, but he figures out that this has this is kind of like the 2020 equivalent of the 2010 red map plan, which is if you control the drawing of the district lines in America, you control the next decade of politics. And as he says, now again, with Trump on the ballot, I never want to act as if there's anything more important than getting rid of him. But the opportunity in 2020 is not just to end the Trump presidency, it's to end gerrymandering. And if you're someone watching the likes of Jim Jordan or some of these state houses that do the craziest of things, you should be upset with Jim Jordan. I don't want to act like he's not accountable. But gerrymandering is what has provided the environment for Jim Jordans to not just succeed, but never be accountable, even when they're so off from the mainstream. So if you want to get rid of Trump, but also get rid of all those House members who've done nothing but stand with Trump, don't bring up nothing on the Russia investigation, nothing in impeachment. It's all they get away with it all because they are in districts that were rigged for them to win for a decade. And 2020 is the opportunity of a lifetime to end gerrymandering. And by the way, not just for the next decade. I believe that if we get into place, because people are so against gerrymandering, only they have the opportunity to do something about it. And so 2020 is the opportunity of a lifetime. I believe if you get into place state Supreme Courts like in Ohio or legislatures who will end gerrymandering, I believe we can actually get rid of it forever if we do well this year. And my hope is of the big problems in politics, dark money, voter suppression and interference, gerrymandering, all three are tough. But the one that is right in front of us in the next 3 months to literally end, and this is why I commend what Eric Holder has been doing, the one that we can actually take off the table right now in states like Ohio and many others is gerrymandering. So it's this huge opportunity. One reason why we resist, there's a debate in the Democratic Party. Well, Biden's ahead in some states. Do we go for broke? Or do we just play small ball and try and win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania? And my attitude is you go for broke now. If we can end gerrymandering in Ohio and all these other states, the opportunity here is not just to send a signal to the world that we reject Trumpism. It's not just to win by so much that interference by Trump can't change the outcome. And I think our mindset has to be they are going to do everything they can to stop Trump from losing. And
including outright cheating, like with the voting machines.
Absolutely.
And that sort of thing.
I mean, I wouldn't put anything past what Putin and the Trump world will try and do. In the single best way to keep that from being successful is to win to try and stop it, obviously, but to win is so big that it doesn't matter. One person
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I want you to finish.
Okay, one person they tried to interfere with a couple of years ago, people forget this, was Macron, when Le Pen was running against him in France.
That's right.
He won by so much, it didn't matter. It was over. And so I think knowing that they're going to have all this stuff coming, that's why I don't think you want to win by just a couple of electoral votes in a few states. If we can have a blue Arizona, a blue Ohio, blue Florida, we end gerrymandering in those states, but we also, it's such a route that any effort to try and sue and stop the outcome, which is a victory, I think would be obviously for naught.
That's fascinating and terrific information. Thank you. I wanted to ask you though about, so we talked about those VVPATs and how nobody looks at them and how that kind of opens an opportunity for malicious actors to rig election outcomes without, really detection, because a manual audit based on a manipulated paper printout that the voter didn't read isn't going to pick up the cheating. And as you know, I've been really worried about these new touchscreen ballot marking devices that also have the same type of paper printout. And a recent study coincided with the VVPAT study showing that most voters don't review it and 93% don't notice errors. And so one strategy that I have been trying to promote, but it doesn't sound all that interesting because I don't think most people understand the vulnerability, is that people should bring their sample ballots with them if they're going to vote in person. This is for in-person voting, but that they should fill out their sample ballot and bring it with them to the polls. And that way, when they look, both on the touchscreen surface itself, this is if you're voting with a touchscreen, although frankly, it speeds up the lines even if you're using a hand-marked paper ballot. You're having it already filled out on your sample ballot makes it that much faster.
Right.
But you can compare what's on the touchscreen and then on that paper printout, because the biggest thing I'm worried about is that those state races are primed for being deleted in particular, not just flipped, but actually just deleted from that printout. And that voters won't know. I mean, most voters are not going to notice that. If they have like 40 things on this printout, they are not going to notice. Most are not going to notice if they look at all. And so I think this is a really important protocol. And I know that a lot of the people who were proponents of ballot marking devices, these new touch screens, after this new study came out showing most voters don't look at them, had said, okay, well, yeah, we'll make sure voters bring sample ballots. But I haven't seen any kind of campaign by those people to make it happen. And what do you think about bringing sample ballots? And
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think if it prompts the voter to really check. But you tweeted something earlier today that to me is the biggest thing we can do, and we are doing it now, is
which is what?
Vote early by mail, but drop it in Dropbox. That to me, that is, we have a 30-day window in Ohio. We are really doing everything we can to encourage that paper ballot being voted, because that's the least likely to be tampered with. It's a paper trail, obviously, in and of itself. One of my worries, and this is again going back to a lot of your work, the further Trump is behind, the more desperate they're going to get to win this thing by all sorts of inappropriate ways, just to put it nicely. And the fact, in my first book, you may remember, the one way that my reporter, what's that?
Your connections. There you are.
Yeah. In my first book, and I didn't mean to do any of this. This was what I was writing was trying to be common sense. One of the ways that Jack Sharp, my main character, figures out that they tampered with the voting machines in the way we talked about was a professor compared the result of the voting machines undervote to the actual mailed-in ballots, which are a control that's not tampered with. And it was the comparison, the professor said, there is a significantly different drop-off rate on the voting machine votes than the ballots that everyone sent in, and it doesn't make sense. And one of my concerns right now is
Mm-hmm.
Trump is beating up on the idea of voting by mail. And if you do any of the research, and I'm sure you've seen this, vote by mail does not help Republicans or Democrats. It's pretty much neutral. So the idea that he's doing it because Democrats are going to benefit in enormous way, that's actually not correct. And I think they know that. I believe the reason he doesn't want people voting by mail is because every vote by mail is a vote that cannot be suppressed on election day.
Actually, can I interrupt for just 1 second on the vote by mail? I just want to do a little bit of a devil's advocate with you because, I mean, first, in case it wasn't already really, really obvious, I think it is. I'm a Democrat, and I'm even, more leaning toward the center than the far left. But I was a Hillary supporter. I'm a Democrat. The notion that vote by mail can't be rigged, I don't agree with that. I don't know that it has different attack vectors than in-person voting. And I think there's a great hypocrisy by the GOP in only calling out vote by mail and not mentioning problems with in-person voting. But I mean, for example, and this doesn't even have to be rigging. I think even without rigging, hundreds of thousands to millions of people don't receive their mail ballots every election. And then that will force them to go to those in-person voting places where they'll have to vote provisionally. And in some states, especially if we're talking about the Deep South, I'm not convinced. I mean, I don't know. People should absolutely vote provisionally if it's their only option. But
no, you're right. Certainly there are problems in the current attacks on the post office and all that. I worry will make it worse.
And also the signature mismatch.
Correct.
I interviewed Don Siegelman, who's the former governor of Alabama, and he said, and he's right, that at least I think he's right, that they're going to have armies of people trying to make the signature mismatch the new hanging chads.
Yeah.
And we'll need an army. So, the message I've been sort of trying to convey is not just vote in numbers too big to manipulate, that our obligation as voters can't end there. We need to sign up to monitor, it's either poll watchers or poll observers, and to help monitor the counting of the absentee ballots. And because they're going to try to just dump a whole bunch of it.
We are right now, just so you know, in Ohio. I agree with what you're saying. And we worry about the signature match. We worry about these attacks on the post office. That's why we are trying to push very hard for many more drop boxes to be included in Ohio that the Board of Elections takes directly. In Northwest Ohio, Toledo, and the rural counties around Toledo, a lot of their mail in the primary went through Detroit. They are still, the boards of elections in some of these counties, and you tweeted about this, are still receiving ballots now.
Right.
A primary that ended months ago. And these attacks on the post office worry us more. So we should be cautious about all this stuff. But one thing we are trying to do is this best practice that Washington State, frankly, even in Georgia did it, as bad as Kemp has been, of drop boxes in counties that are not just one, because that will lead to long lines again, but many that go right to the Board of Elections, but that takes out any temptation by the Trump administration, which they will grab hold of, to use the post office as a way to screw up vote by mail. So we're advocating for that. My guess is we'll get pushback because, again, I think among among the Trump side, their view of a good election right now is what we saw in Atlanta a few weeks ago. Really long lines, people leaving, people scared, a messed up vote by mail system. If Trump falls enough behind in the election, that's their only hope of winning.
Well, that seems to be sort of the formula. The vote by mail will be screwed up, which will force people into these combined vote centers that many of them, they've started deploying these electronic poll books throughout the United States. It's like another huge, three things have kind of spiked in the past 5 years because I've been watching these trends with the vendors. And one is the electronic poll books, which are the check-in computers, and they are often Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connected. So, at best, if you're talking about things that go wrong, Wi-Fi connection. That's what happened in Los Angeles County, where it was, not even a voter suppression state. It was complete chaos in Los Angeles County when the electronic poll books couldn't connect. And then they have the ballot marking devices. And then in many cases, they're activating the ballot marking devices with the Wi-Fi connected electronic poll books now. So they use the poll books to encode an activation card with the barcode that they then put into the ballot marking device to pull up the races. And no one's really studied, none of the experts have really studied that. But then also the wireless modems in precinct scanners is sort of a new thing. Do you know, in in Ohio, are there wireless modems in the precinct scanners?
The Secretary of State has said there are not. I mean, is what I've heard him say. And you're the expert on more of the stuff you just mentioned than I am.
I haven't heard that. I haven't heard of Ohio as being one of the states that has them, but
he said they're not, and I take him in as
probably not.
What I know, but no, I mean, I do worry, and again, I won't get into your field of expertise in some of this stuff, but no, there's a lot coming at once. We had a real problem, and I think it was less complex than just basic error, but we've had this problem the last couple of years in Ohio of purging voters. And there was the current Secretary of State. So Ohio has purged voters for a decade. We sued, and we're one of the states that became the model for other states, including Georgia, where the infrequent voting became the trigger of ultimately being purged. If you missed a couple elections, you got on the list.
Right.
And we fought in court. We got all the way that we won the Sixth Circuit, which these days is not easy to do. We lost 5-4 at the Ohio Supreme Court, so they're still doing it. But the current Secretary of State, who has good days and bad days, he had a good day in that he decided for the first time ever to put out the list of voters who were scheduled to be purged, so everyone could look at them before they were purged.
Yeah.
And the League of Women Voters and a lot of Democratic staff at the State House started going through these lists. And we found that 20% of the voters on that list had actually voted appropriately, and they were on the list in complete error.
20%? Wow.
20%.
Something else, whenever purging comes up, if I can just interrupt really quickly, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Whenever purging comes up, I feel like people should mention the 2000 presidential election where Katherine Harris, who is the Republican Secretary of State, mistakenly purged 12,000 people, supposedly on the basis that they were felons, and she admitted afterwards it was a mistake, they weren't.
Yeah.
So, and that was an election decided by 537 votes.
Right. And these people were purged. So this was a list of about 200,000 people. Maybe it was more than 200,000. And so it was tens of thousands of people. Now, the good news was ironically, one of the people purged was the president of the League of Women Voters of Ohio.
Oh, gosh. Well, at least that helps with the court case.
I voted in every election. How in the world am I on this? Oh, we're sorry, we made a mistake. These purges happened for people like, a lot of it was the county boards and the state, Secretary of State were swapping lists in the wrong way. They were marking things the wrong way. But here's what's scary. So that was what we found before the purge happened. And we all said to the Secretary of State, my God, 20% of the people on your list that if you hadn't have shown it to us, you didn't find the mistake. Volunteers did. The League of Women Voters did. The ACLU did. Doesn't that make you think you shouldn't go forward on the purge? And he charged forward with it. And now they got those 20% off.
Well, and part of the mistake was ES&S made part of that mistake, though, right? That was
a
voting machine vendor. What were they doing?
Vendors,
right. What were they involved in purges? That seemed really weird to me. Do you know?
One of the things that happened was the vendor made the mistake. And I don't care who made the mistake. The voter didn't make the mistake. So why are they on the purge list? And until you can tell us why all these mistakes are being made, you shouldn't do one purge. Instead, they move forward with a purge. And guess what? Within weeks, some of our very smart state legislators found yet again that more people had been incorrectly purged. But here's what's scary. That was the only list we've ever seen. So think about it. 2 million people purged since 2010, a 20% error rate. You mentioned the Katherine Harris number. If you just project out the 20% error rate, or let's make it 10%, that's hundreds of thousands of people.
That's horrifying.
No fault of their own, and they just keep moving forward as if they did. They blame the vendor, they blame the county. At the end of the day, the one person who's faulted is not as a voter, and no one should be purged until they get the system figured out. But
I agree with that. What it seems like the Republicans do is they take something that has a grain of truth to it. Like, yes, a few people vote fraudulently. Oftentimes they're Republicans. I'm sure there are some Democrats who do it too, but it's a small problem, and then they use it as an excuse to use this blunt force instrument to keep people from voting. And I think the same thing is true with the voter list. There may very well be people on the list who shouldn't be there, but most of those are not going to be voting. And even if if it happened, it's more likely election fraud than voter fraud. The distinction being election fraud is by insiders, voter fraud is by individuals. Right. And it seems like, and after 5 years, the Bush administration tried to find, they investigated voter fraud for 5 years, and that was that big U.S. attorney scandal where they fired all the U.S. attorneys who wouldn't pursue the myth of mass voter fraud, and they found just like a handful of cases. But there is something I want to bring up because somebody else pointed it out to me, and Trump always likes to project, and so when he's saying that fake voters are going to be added, are going to vote by mail, and everyone says it's impossible, it gives me pause. Number one, I don't think we should be saying it's impossible because that's what we did in 2016. That's sort of what Barack Obama did about voting machines and such. And then we were not in a good position to say maybe we should take a look at these voting machine results. I just don't think we should overpromise it. But on vote by mail, somebody pointed out to me that the printing companies are kind of this potential vulnerability because, well, number one, there's just a lot of them and no one is really vetting them, I don't think. But they get all the change of address lists. And so if they have those lists, and they also have all the signatures on, they're computerized. People's signatures are computerized. And so if you have a corrupt insider at the printing company, they can tell who's moved out of state, and they can who's still on the voter roll. I mean, and then they can see if they're still on the voter rolls if they haven't been removed, and then they can just vote for them. And I'm wondering, why doesn't the Democratic Party seem to do anything? I'm not targeting Ohio. I haven't looked at. Seems like you probably do more than most. But why doesn't the National Democratic Party seem to take actual fraud seriously? The potential for actual fraud. So, for example, one thing you could do would be to get these lists, and compare them against who voted and see if people who moved actually voted. Because I would not put it at all past the GOP to do that.
Well, obviously we should, or be
anybody really.
Yeah. We should be looking at. I actually was going to bring up this list. This is why the purging process that they have used, where they've used someone not voting in 2 elections as the beginning of the path to being purged. The truth is, it's not hard to find. They're using that as a blunt instrument to find people who have passed away or moved. And as you just said, we actually have lists of changes of address.
Right. Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Of people who passed away.
Excellent point.
We can look at those lists. That other list is not needed.
So my concern is they're doing both, though. Like they're doing these fake overbroad purges to get rid of Democrats mostly, and then they're keeping what about the death notices? I read somewhere that one of the secretaries of states are like, oh, don't worry about. They were trying to comfort everybody about Trump, saying, I think it was Michigan probably. Don't worry, we get the death notices. We know to purge them. But what if you have corrupt insiders? They have the death notices. They just don't take them off. And that's vote by mail because it's harder.
I don't want to. I mean, I think it's obviously something. You can see who's passed away and who's moved, and we all should be making sure that never are those people down as people vote.
Does the Democratic Party look for that though? Does it even look? It doesn't. I don't think.
I mean, I can't speak to the broader. I can't. I'll say this: the broader, the people who really watch the voter files, I can't speak to as to what they do after an election to dig in. The Ohio Democratic Party, we haven't done that, but I can't speak to the data people who are out there who really go through the voter file with a fine-tooth comb and are keeping track of who's moved and other things. But let me say this on the broader point about purging is whenever we bring up in Ohio, you are purging too many people.
Yes.
They immediately say to us, oh, Democrats want dead people to vote or people who move to vote. And we say, no, actually, we have no problem with you using those very specific lists which exist. But the list you are using isn't the list of people who passed away. It's not the list of people who moved that we all have. You're using a different list. So they like to confuse. The minute we try and push back on purging, they make this false argument that somehow you just can't figure out who's passed away or who's moved unless you knock off all these other people who haven't passed away, haven't moved, and you're only knocking them off because they didn't vote in a couple of elections. And so it really is this bad faith argument. But if you ever look at whenever we push to stop purging or to at least make it, of course we want to update, and this goes to your point, of course we should update the voter rolls so people who passed away and moved shouldn't be on them. No one's arguing with that. but their pushback is to make it seem as if we can do that without purging everybody else.
They're not doing it in a way that you would do it if you had a good faith intent just to purge those voters.
Correct. And it's not that hard. This is the world where literally, I hate to say too much, but like companies know where we're walking based upon our cell phone. Okay. Right. The idea that you couldn't figure out in today's technology how to take off from a list people who've died or moved without getting all these other people caught up in the system is not a good faith argument.
Tony, I'm worried that they're having their cake and eating it too. They're doing bogus purges for the most part, and then they have those lists so they can they can, if they want to pad a little bit here and there. And I mean, I don't want to terrify people from voting. I'm not saying this is happening in mass numbers, but I think it's important to keep in mind that I don't think we can't say any of our voting is 100% secure. They all have vulnerabilities, and the key is to know what they are, to be a little bit of a creative thinker about it and try to address them. And I really am hoping, something like the sample ballots, I think is one really good protocol. Another one I think would be to get these lists of people who moved in afterwards, especially if the Democrats lose, they need to get those lists and comb through it, especially in a place like Florida, and make sure that it wasn't Trump who is adding voters.
This is where I don't want I still believe in our democratic system, and I don't want to. I always hesitate before being too
pessimistic,
scary about voting. But no doubt, I think we should always be thinking through, and this is what's sort of my books. What are the vulnerabilities, and do everything we can on the front side to minimize the risk, and do everything on the backside to ensure that something didn't happen that we haven't figured out. So I agree with that. And that's why I don't have, no one has a problem with removing people who've passed away or moved from a voting list. That is something that if you allow millions of voters to stay on a roll that have passed away, that's not good. That opens up a vulnerability. But Republicans have used that as an excuse to get rid of people who still are with us.
Exactly.
Live where they used to live. But I don't disagree that we need to be more vigilant than we've ever been with protecting on the front end against any efforts to fraudulent voting, et cetera. And then on the back end, everything we can to keep up with. One of the things I think, the idea that we only audit every blue moon after an election versus every single time, to me, makes no sense. I mean, there's a lot we can be doing. And someone asked me this the other day, and I think you would agree with this. Well, how I was doing a book conversation. How have we, since 16, when you wrote your book, and since all the interference, what have we done to make things better? And my answer was, we're doing the same thing we did with the pandemic. Nothing. We haven't learned a thing. We've done nothing better. And we are as at risk now as we were in 16, except for one thing. We've told the other countries that we don't have a problem with them doing it. I mean, basically everything. So
we're worse. In some ways, we're worse off.
Yeah, everyone from Roger Stone being let off to the way the Mueller report was treated to everything else.
To the fact we never got a manual audit in 2016.
Correct.
And half the people are a manual recount, and they think that recount meant something.
Right. And so the point is, we've done nothing to make it better, and we've sent a signal to the folks who would interfere that, especially if you succeed, everything just happens per your success. And so I do think that we haven't been vigilant enough on the front end, and we have to also obviously dig in after the fact, because whatever vulnerability is out there, a hostile actor will move as quickly as they can to go after it. And that does worry me on all fronts.
I mean, I will say, so I was just looking through some of the stuff that Ohio does do, and you do have backup paper poll books for your electronic poll books, which a lot of places don't. Like, according to a 2018 Brennan Center study, I think it said about half don't. So that's good. So if those Wi-Fi connected poll books go down, at least you have a paper backup. So that's good. Your touchscreen voting machines, do you know I assume you must have backup. Do you know if people have the option to use a hand-marked paper ballot if they want to?
At every place, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I do believe we have paper backup for everywhere.
Yeah, but the paper backup could be those VV. Well, my concern is more that the concern I'm speaking to at the moment,
Go
there's
down.
lots of different ones, but that they just don't work. They
Right.
all go down,
Right.
especially if they have to be activated by Wi-Fi connected poll books. So then even if you have that backup poll book, you can't turn on your ballot marking devices. So that's something to look at. I don't know if you have those or not.
Yeah, we'll look at that.
And then, do you know, is the Democratic Party hiring observers to, I mean, are you guys making an effort to hire observers for the polls and to hire observers for the counting of absentee ballots? And if not, do you know who is?
Yeah, no, I was gonna, actually, this is an area that is, I take back a little bit what I said earlier. The one area in which we are better positioned than 16 is in this area. Thanks, actually, one of the real heroes this year is Stacey Abrams and her Fair Fight operation.
Yeah.
Normally, and this would worry you about before. Normally, what would happen is sometime in August or so, a state party like Ohio would have a single voter protection director brought on in August to then build up the operation for November of poll observers, et cetera. Because of Stacey Abrams' support, we have actually had our voter protection director on since January. And we now have a 4-person staff, paid staff, along with a lot of volunteer lawyers who are all together and been on board for some time and will only get bigger. They have a number of assignments. One is to look out for, any county where something seems amiss. All of a sudden we hear talk of consolidation. If all of a sudden we're getting complaints, we run a hotline late in the campaign. But the other big thing that we are doing, especially, and Republican Party has a plan then now that the consent decree has expired to have, quote, challengers all over states.
Exactly. Right.
People who consider suspicious voters, which we know what that means, voter intimidation.
And they'll do it for the absentee counting also, I'm sure.
Correct.
The same people.
So what we are doing is one of the top priorities of our team is, you'll see me tweet about it every so often, always recruiting poll observers.
Good.
And poll workers who we call them poll workers here, but those are election judges in other states. And given the virus and a lot of our traditional poll workers who are senior are opting out, it's even more of a need. But we are nonstop recruiting people to be poll observers. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, go to our Ohio Democratic Party website.
I will.
Up there. And I'll keep tweeting it out. I'll send you the link at some point so you'll see it. But as much as we need volunteers to get out the vote, equally important will be poll observers. And our view of these people is you are protecting the constitutional right to vote one voter at a time at every poll. Or as you're saying, watching absentees come in. And you may be doing this with a Republican standing right next to you trying to scare that voter away. So it's more important than ever that we have these poll observers and poll workers. The other reason to do this is I believe they will use a shortage of poll workers as an excuse to consolidate polling locations. And we will take away that excuse by saying, hey, we're out recruiting, young Democrats, college Democrats, law school Democrats. Don't you dare think you're going to use poll worker shortage as an excuse. We found you a lot of poll workers. We're trying to get CLE credit for people who take poll worker training. That's halfway through the process. So one way that every state, there are a lot of things we can do here. One way that every state party can help with some of the things you're talking about is to get enough volunteers to be poll observers, poll workers, and also staff the hotline that we will have in the final weeks, especially as people are voting absentee or hearing from their county board of elections. We want to staff that hotline and be able to take every single call we get saying something amiss is happening. So that's a very important part of what we're building. And the good news is we have more infrastructure right now to do this work than we've ever had. That's terrific.
Can I ask you about the hotline briefly?
Sure.
So another protocol that I really was hoping somebody would do, and I don't think anyone has, is it has to do with voter suppression. So for example, voters who are completely disenfranchised, who go to the polls and can't stay because the lines are too long or something, or because all the machines are down. And I feel like the voter protection hotline provides an invaluable service, and so do other hotlines that are similar to that. But what's really frustrating is they don't publish their numbers, and I don't know that they get contact information necessarily and who they would have voted for. So we can't ever capture those numbers for election challenges if we need it. And I feel like we actually need hate to say website because it can be hacked, but a website or a hotline where the purpose isn't, I mean, they can help too if they want, but to report these problems and tabulate them and be able to contact the people again if you need it for an election challenge, because that could be part of the GOP plan. And to my knowledge, we don't have anything like that. Do you know have you heard of anything like that?
I don't, I mean, I could talk to my voter protection team about exactly what they record, but I will say our hotline was very, we had a primary where we basically had election day canceled because of the virus, and it became an all-male primary. It led to a lot of questions, and the hotline was very helpful for the exact reason you just described. It wasn't just a way to put out one fire at a time. The tabulation of all the calls really gave us a good picture of the broader problems that were happening, and we were able to triage, hey, the biggest issue is they think the election ends on this date, it ends on that date. And so it can be used, I think, to collect what in the way you're talking about.
Richard, can you use it in court?
That, if done right, like you said, could also be included in challenges.
I mean, it was really
about that.
Yeah, so a director from the Amazon cloud had called me saying that Amazon was really interested in helping and what could they do, and that was my suggestion, and I ran it past a few other election integrity advocates, and they all thought it was a great idea. And then Amazon lost interest, so it didn't happen.
Well, I'll talk to my team about it because, by the end, we're getting tons of calls, and I do think it is probably we were getting better information on what was happening in the primary than anybody else because of this hotline. As you tabulated all the concerns. That's
great. I hope if you're not getting contact information, I hope you do so that you can use it for election challenges. One other question. Why do you think it is that Democrats always concede when they lose, even if it's a suspicious, or I should put it this way, even if it's a dubious loss? So, for example, Beto O'Rourke, they had the flipping voting machines. John Kerry, 04, who said they suspected manipulation. Right. Hillary Clinton didn't file an election challenge. What is Andrew Gillum, Bill Nelson? Stacey Abrams didn't file an election challenge. She's done a whole lot else, which is amazing, but she didn't actually file an election challenge. Is this coming from the DNC? What is the problem?
That I would say that I think that there is a fidelity to our democratic process, that we accept the results of elections, and I think that is a very strong pressure that when it's over, the good faith small d democratic thing to do is to concede and let the voters speak, and so I think that's sort of the default that exists, and that's an understandable default. I think in a world where we know that hostile actors are taking on new ways that are harder to find to change outcomes, which they are, I do think people should be hesitant to concede until they really see that not only is the margin what it is, but that there's no sense that there was a problem.
Well, how do we change that, though? Because
I think there's clearly a politics to concession that frankly, in a world without interference, actually makes a lot of sense. We are a country that has peaceful transitions of power, and that's something that's very important. But I also think that your question is, well, what if there's hostile actors that are taking advantage of that instinct to have you move on before you've ever had a chance to actually see if the election was legitimate? If you ask, it's not something the DNC. It's not. It is. I think it's literally the instinct of Americans is when there's an election outcome, we live by it. We don't want to look like we're contesting democracy itself, and I think it's the right default. But I also think in close elections, or if there's signs of a real problem, I think holding out to make sure it was legit is actually what our attitude has to be.
I mean, I've heard that a lot of Beto voters were very bitter that he didn't do anything. That they owe it to. I mean, people put their money, their heart, their souls into these campaigns only to have their candidates just roll over belly up. And I think there's something wrong with the culture then with the Democratic Party. And I very much want to improve it. I don't want to destroy it. I want to improve it, but I don't know how to improve it without saying it. So Don Siegelman, his is one of the most obviously suspect election losses I've ever heard of. But it was 2002. It was in Alabama. He was governor. He'd been AG governor, lieutenant governor. He's Alabama's last Democratic governor. Karl Rove was the good friend of the campaign consultant for his opponent. there was in the middle, he was declared, Siegelman won the race. He was declared victorious. It was called by the AP and everyone. And then in the middle of the night, after the courthouse was closed, where they posted the results and everybody went home, in this one county, this one Republican county, a new set of returns appeared on the outside of the courthouse door, showing that he'd lost from one precinct 6,000 votes in this one Republican precinct in Republican County. And he wanted to go do a recount just of that one precinct. Seems reasonable. But Karl Rove's client was the Alabama AG, and they seized the paper ballots and they illegally certified the outcome prematurely. And then they locked up Siegelman. That's usually the story that gets all the attention, and it was done on 60 Minutes. But it's really well documented, and it's just shady as hell. And he told me that he is not one to bash on the Democratic Party. I think actually, if anybody could, it would be him, because for whatever reason, the Democratic Party did not back him up on his political prosecution by the Bush administration or anything.
Right.
But even as to his loss, he said the Democratic Party was just silent. I mean, what the hell? This can't happen again in 2016. I'm not lecturing you. I'm so frustrated. And I actually have someone who's a chair of a party. And I mean, we don't, as you know, if we don't audit these outcomes and we don't do manual recounts, and it's to pretend that it's just Russia is also ridiculous. I think that at least for down ballot races, there has been some sleazy actors doing sleazy stuff. Maybe, I mean, for some of these races, it doesn't mean it has to be the whole system and this, it's going to take.
I think it's a fair point. And I think the best solution is to not have it. It's what you just alluded to and I did earlier, to have built into our election system the protection of automatic audits, not have it be, what it is now, which is very shoddy at best.
But it's not happening.
Because I think people, this is just my honest answer, just as an observer, I think people feel like there's like a political risk in looking like not just a sore loser, but someone who's like not allowing the voters to have spoken by questioning it, even though I think every year that goes by, the truth is there's more reason to potentially question an outcome because there are more ways that people can rig that outcome or interfere with that outcome. But
from what I understand, Al Franken is the only one who actually did a recount, and then he won on his recount.
Right.
I think he reversed an outcome. I'm not sure. Maybe he won the original too.
I think he did. But I just think that our systems are set up to assume, interference is rare and
it's bullshit.
that you only
it's
look
just not true.
It. Right. No, but
we don't know. Actually, let me put it this way: we don't know if it's true.
I know, and that's
because we don't look.
But I'm trying. I actually. Yeah. And so I think one of the problems is that the current triggers of when to look closely into an outcome are only if it's very close, and that's a mistake, I think, because.
Sure.
It means
you can manipulate an election to make it not very close.
Yeah, you can make it so that it'll never get looked at. And that's why I think automatic audits, clearly having real paper trails like.
You mean a manual audit, right? Not just because I think the public didn't understand. And I mean, that was a big wake up call for all of its failures, that recount. It educated at least a handful of people, me being one, that rerunning the ballots through an electronic machine, just rerunning the machines isn't what a manual recount or manual audit is supposed to be. A meaningful one has to be.
So I think the way we look at after the fact, was an election legitimate, is not keeping up with all the ways that people can actually interfere with elections. And
here's the other thing.
Having it be on the shoulders of the individual candidate. This is, I think, the ultimate solution. Rather than having it be on the individual shoulders of the candidate to say, I think I won and that's not legitimate, or the party, build into your actual structure of how you keep up with elections after the fact, that it's done more as a matter of course, so people don't have to feel like that they're told they're not accepting a loss that they don't think is legitimate. I mean, I really do think that if that were possible, that'd be a lot better than. But
it's not possible right now. It's not possible.
No,
for 2020,
kind of thing.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think it's a good conversation, and and not to get back to this book I've written, but one of the other challenges.
No, you should. I definitely want you to talk.
One
about
of the other challenges
put your book.
of this is
it's fascinating.
The lower on the totem pole
mm-hmm.
an election is, the less grounds you have to challenge the outcome. And that's part of the point of the book is, who knows why 500 votes shifted in a state house race? And if there isn't the kind of polling there is in a big race, no one even has grounds to say, well, that outcome didn't look right. Something happened. And so I do think that the more you can have built-in protections and post-election audits to give everyone certainty, and they have to be quick enough so it doesn't,
the chain of custody of the ballots between election night and the audit has to be preserved. Yeah.
No, I think the more that's built in, the less it will be put on individual candidates who I would say will feel like the minute you start saying something was weird, half the world thinks you're literally, engaged in a conspiracy theory. And that's where
that culture has to change. It's just silly. I mean, it's silly. I think the more we say it, it propagates itself. Yeah. And
no, I understand.
The GOP files election challenges. I mean, they do it, and they're right. They should do it. We don't know if these outcomes are correct. I mean, I personally don't think. I think if election people are cheating, the GOP would be running circles around the Democrats, because you can't really, at least with the current group, you can't really out corrupt them. But the thing that really, all right, here's like maybe my last point was, we're not going to get these, I don't think, meaningful manual audits in 2020, because that requires cooperation, right. From people in power, and they're not giving it, especially the GOP, which shot down all of those election security bills.
Right.
Mitch McConnell and who was the one in Tennessee? I forget her name. But in any event, one thing that we could do that election integrity advocates advocate, and that I tried to get campaigns to do in 2018 and was blown off by the Beto campaign, even though I got up to the tops of the Beto campaign, I actually had people who have many connections. We spoke to the right people, and they didn't do this, is comparing the precinct totals to the reported totals to at least make sure that those two match, because the central tabulator is where the reported totals come from. And that is sort of it isn't the only vulnerability or the only place you could rig an election, but it is a major hub, because it aggregates all of the precinct totals for the whole county or state. So it seems like comparing those two would be done as a matter of course, and that at least the large campaigns with tons of money, I mean, some of these campaigns had so much money they couldn't spend it all.
Right.
They could have had observers go, and at least for some of the key counties, have them go out, photograph these poll tapes and compare them to the reported totals. And they will not do it. They don't do it. They don't do it. And it drives me freaking bananas. So now a bunch of groups are trying to do it, but we don't have any money. And it's just it's really frustrating. So protectourvotes.com, we're starting to try to do it with some primaries. smartelections.us is going to maybe do it. Scrutineers is going to maybe do it. Democracy Counts. But, these are all small groups, and we shouldn't have to do this. Our candidates, the ones who have that extra money, should be doing it. And how do I get them to do it?
I was going to say, actually, to the extent we have poll observers at these polls, that's something we can incorporate. So
would you
send me, you got my contact stuff. Yeah, I will. I mean, yeah, I think it's a good idea. I mean, I think the more we can verify, the better. And if you send me precisely what you're
I will.
specifically saying, and if we are successful in having thousands of poll observers, which is our goal, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to do that as part.
That would be amazing.
Because I think I'm a believer that, again, going back to your question, why don't people do it? The more you had automatic verification without putting it on the candidate,
right,
to be the one to stand out in a crowd and everyone thinks, okay, the election's over, time to move on, and they have to take it on themselves to all sorts of criticism. The more it's built in, and the more the verification is happening, so there's a numeric break. If there's a problem, you're like, look, it doesn't add up. That's exactly the better way to do it versus after the fact trying to go to court. So no,
because I don't know if you saw my video. I'm interrupting him, but I want to just get it in really quick. I'm sorry. No, go ahead. You go.
No, I wasn't saying anything. Go ahead.
You weren't? Okay. No. So the video that I had that got the clip that got the 500,000 views. It was a story that was actually originally reported in Bloomberg, but didn't really get any traction. I think because headlines are so important, and the headline was generic, and it had to do with a commissioner in Shelby County, Tennessee, which is the largest county. It has Memphis in it, and his name is Benny Smith, and he's a friend of mine. He's a longtime election integrity advocate and a losing Democratic candidate. They had paperless machines, in the sense that they didn't have paper ballots or even those VVPATs. the Democrats had since 2010. It's a majority African American county, and the Republicans kept sweeping the county races. And the Democrats would file election challenges, but they couldn't. They kept getting tossed out of court because they couldn't prove anything because they didn't have paper ballots or even crappy VV-pads. And she asked him if there was anything he could do, and he said, "Let me think about it." And he didn't expect to find anything at all, but he figured out where some of the African American priests predominantly would be, like a black church or whatever. And he went and he looked, and sure enough, these poll tapes put the reported totals that come out of the voting machine. That's like a long strip of paper after the polls close.
Right.
And it puts all the totals on. And then he went and compared it to the reported totals. And sure enough, all the Democrats were losing votes. The totals from those precincts, which were probably almost entirely Democrat, were getting diluted. They were not coming out on the other end. And so then Bloomberg got on the story. It was really a bombshell, and the Republican head of the county election commission retired like 2 days later. People were calling for a criminal investigation, and Bloomberg came out and they checked the entire county, and they found 20 other precincts that were all predominantly African American with the same exact thing, where the totals coming out of the precincts a lot of them were not making it into the reported outcomes. And it was a really big deal. It wasn't enough to support an election challenge because the margin of victory was small. It was a little bit larger, which is what's so frustrating, because I do think in some cases we may be suffering death by 1,000 cuts, and you need to kind of have all of them in the same lawsuit, or it won't add up to enough to exceed that margin. There was voter suppression too, no doubt, but Georgia had the same thing, 127,000 based on a poll tape review. It was a more complicated analysis there, but 127,000 mostly black neighborhood votes disappeared. Mm-hmm. And these poll tapes are just a really valuable tool. Unfortunately, with those consolidated centers, if they're jumbling all the, if everyone in the entire state or entire county can vote at any one of these polling centers, then you're not going to get these, or it makes it a lot harder to get these poll tapes.
Right.
So.
No, but we can. I think that's certainly something we can look into for our poll observers to have them.
That would be so cool.
I mean, what's funny is that campaigns will do that to some degree because they want to figure out who's already voted and who hasn't. And so you then, you check it out at different parts of the day because you want to actually go call the people who haven't actually voted. So you're doing it anyway.
Well, not really the poll tapes per se, though. They're just kind of finding out turnout. Just to I'm going to write this up in an article, but electronic poll books, these sort of new things, they can be remoted into. And I have a former election official from the South. He stopped being an election official relatively recently, and they'd already bought these poll books. He said that there's like a website, and you can go and watch who's signing in real time. And he's very concerned. This guy's even a Republican. He's very concerned that, you give those totals to a candidate and they know where to pad, where to whatever. It's just another, I think the things that we can do where we don't require cooperation from elected Republican officials, the more checks we can implement that don't require that we can just do on our own, even if they're not complete.
Right.
We should do it.
Well, but back to your bigger point too, though. I mean, my hope is that we have a success in November, not just with the House and the presidency, but with the Senate.
Yes.
And hopefully we get that, and we are able to push through. And this is where I'd love to hear your ideas on it, and I'm sure others would too. What are the big protections that can be put into, the equivalent of what they tried to do with House Bill 1? A big voter protection bill that builds into the sort of the nonstop election process protection on the front and the back end. That's much wider in scope than a recount if it's within a certain number of votes, which is just scratching the surface. I think my hope is there is that opportunity after November, and that we'll have a Senate that be willing to do it, because it really is. I do think that it's these days, if you're trying to do bad things, exactly what triggers it being looked at, and you just avoid that, and then you can go do your bad things. And I think we need to have a much broader, broad enough process that there's a much higher likelihood, or almost a guarantee, that you'll catch any malfeasance. And right now, it's clear that that's not the case.
I agree with that. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to mention about the voter file? Just briefly, what is a voter file? Maybe tell.
Yeah. So the voter file itself is it is the large database. And I'm using it sort of as slang. I mean, they're different. Each party has its own file. And the voter file, in one way, is every state's list of all their voters. But then each party and all the campaigns basically take that list and they break it down into a huge database of voters that they ultimately use as their game plan of how to win the election. You've got your first sure voters for you that you want to make sure they turn out. You've got your swing voters that you need to persuade. You have voters that you just assume are voting for the other side. And so the voter file, as a candidate, you are spending the entire campaign, every door knock, every text message, every digital ad, you are doing everything you can in an attempt to get, the most accurate look at the winning numbers to your election. And the voter file, the book, is essentially making the point that this is the crown jewel of your campaign. We read about how in 2016 they stole John Podesta's emails. They might have even taken polling data. And then every once in a while, the story will say, oh, and they may have gotten voter data too. And
well, yeah, what the smart tech, that's basically Russia. Jim Comey, the master of understatement, except when it comes to emails, Hillary's emails, said, oh, yeah, by the way, yeah, they hacked smart tech, some old GOP stuff at smart tech, which hosted the voter vault. And now there was a recent report, right, that said that there is on the market some Russians I don't know if they're in Russia, some Russian hackers said that there's like a database of about the same number of people you would have expected to be in the voter vault in 2015 that's like going on the open market.
Right.
That's crazy.
And the point of my book is to say, listen, when you see that sentence that says, yeah, they hacked emails and polling data in the voter file, that, hacking emails isn't good, but that's not the end of the world. It was embarrassing, bad stuff came out. Polls aren't that bad. But the voter file is an entirely different matter. I mean, this is literally tons of data.
And it ranks people, right? Can you tell me about the ranking?
Yeah, you are giving each voter a score as to how you think they're going to vote. If you give them a score if they're entirely guaranteed to vote for you, a 0 if they're not. But you also have in there, things they subscribe to. Every year that goes by, there's going to be more in there. And so not only is it an issue of privacy, we are rightfully concerned about private companies and how they hold on to data. There's a lot of data in here that a voter would not want to have out in the open. But the other thing is, it's also, and this is sort of the plot of the book, it's also, in the end, this data isn't static. It is the game plan. It informs the strategy to go win a campaign. So if a hostile force, so this book is basically the worst case scenario. If someone were to get a hold of the voter file of your party or your campaign, the damage they could do to your effort to win would be exponential compared to if they stole your emails. And
what dawned on me? I have a question for you about this. Maybe I misunderstood, but it seems like, all right, let's just say that Russia has the Republican voter file, but not the Democratic voter file. But if they're ranking you 1 to 5, the 5s are the ones who are going to vote Democrat, right? So that gives, we don't really need both of them, right? They only need one.
Correct. They're going to be the mirror reverse of each other, you'd assume. And so if you had one, now in my book, again, I don't give too much away, they have both, which makes it even more, easy to know what's going on. But yeah, you could have one, or in the end, you could also try and create your own. But the point is, if you had one side's, as long as that side is doing a good job, and here's one part of the book, it says this, the more effective the data keeper has been, the better the heist is. If they're really good at data, if it's really accurate, if it's really up to date, hacking that file, you'll do better than if they were some, incompetent campaign. But no, you could, if you had one party's, because both parties are building the same thing, if you just had one party's, you would have, and you had access. Now, let's talk the real world. The parties work very hard to create ceilings of access. If you're a state house member, you only have access to your state house district's data. As you go up the chain, some people have a much higher access. So my book is sort of people literally getting the highest level access. And if you did that, even if you just had one parties, you would have yourself, a whole lot of information that would tell you essentially, like you're saying, about both sides. All of us would be in both parties' files, ranked obviously the exact opposite based on who they turn out.
And then even above and beyond, like having real-time access to it where you manipulate those numbers, you could also just use it for sort of the thing that gets almost the most attention with the Russian hacking, which is disinformation campaigns. They can target people with your 1s through 5s if they wanted to do that. So
in my book, they meddle with it, which makes it even harder. They make it so that the campaign's data is no longer accurate. So there's literally moments where they're calling voters to turn out who actually are going to vote against them, which would be a campaign's worst nightmare. But yeah, I mean, and this could go back to 2016. You wouldn't even have to meddle, and this is why the end is a little bit of a twist of the book. You wouldn't even have to meddle for this information to help you in an election. If you had everyone's targeting data and you knew how they were ranked, well, you could do your own social media, your own text messaging to do what you wanted that voter to do, whether it be they don't show up at all or whether it be you make sure they turn out. So even if you no longer could access the file, if you knew what the file was, you could do a lot of damage. And that's sort of it's sort of the next level of what you could do, what damage you could cause. As you won't accept the premise, but the premise of my third book is that after the first book, they solved the problems of attacking voting machines. So this is, even if you solved all that, you still this is one area where there's if someone were to do it, it could cause a whole lot of problems.
I didn't remember that they solved it. I guess I'm gonna have to go back and read them again.
It's sort of an assumption that's no longer. That's the first book. The first book is they hacked machines and they did this and that. And this book is it's sort of just assumed that okay, you'll see there's a part where Congress really cracked down on voter machine security. There's a little bit of that because
that's right.
So this book is, what if they've done that for real?
We're never safe.
What risks are still there? Well, one risk is this one, that with all the social media and disinformation potential, with if you were to get into this database, what you could do. I mean, basically, you're messing. It'd be like going to a football playbook and messing up all the plays, and the players don't know it, and that's obviously hugely damaging. And the idea. And some won't think, well, this could never happen. If you were a hostile actor, you would. They
have a database. I mean, I don't even think it's disputed, right? It didn't get any coverage. But they do have it. Russia has a database.
They're going for it, and if they wanted to cause trouble, they would go. Taking John Podesta's emails again. That would be the tip of the iceberg of the data you really want. What you really would want is exactly this data.
Well, you'd also want the Republican Party's emails, which they have, and then you use them as compromat. I think
that's my second book. I don't know if you've read that one. My second book.
I did read it. I didn't remember. I guess
it's all about compromat, and I do agree that would be, and that is still a strange. And
I'm worried that that's a little bit of that is going on, because it seems pretty clear to me that Trump uses threats, and it was Ronan Farrow, I think, who said that Israeli spies were trying to find compromat on journalists and members of the Obama administration who helped with the Iran deal. Right. They were trying to. I mean, it seems pretty. And then Omarosa, told some reporter that they had a dossier on the reporter. I mean, it seems pretty clear. A Republican whistleblower said that Karl Rove had hired her to try to find sexually compromising information on Don Siegelman, which she couldn't find. It wasn't there. But I mean, it seems pretty clear that is an established tactic, at least by the Republican Party. And then you put it on steroids if you have help from Russia. A lot of Republicans didn't like Donald Trump, and some of them, like Lindsey Graham and Bob Corker, who was hugely anti-Trump, resigned after he played golf with Trump. And I don't know. I mean, they use smart tech. Smart tech was launched by Russia.
It's clearly an old Russian tactic of getting that information, I certainly, I think we're gonna in the coming years. Let's assume Trump loses the presidency. in the coming years, we're gonna find out a lot more about why he never says no to Putin. And as my second book sort of writes, I think it will be tied to all sorts of dealings he had in Russia that everyone knew about and have receipts on. So we'll
Yeah,
see.
but I want to know also why the GOP never says no to Trump. And
Right.
I think it's the same thing for some
Oh,
of them,
yeah,
not everybody.
it could.
Never know.
I think it could be that. I also think they're at this point just so scared of their own voters that they don't want to. But we'll see. I mean, I do think the fact that they hacked both sides and we've only heard of the Democratic side is certainly a something we should all be concerned about.
And it doesn't, but no one really talks about it. So I'm glad
Like
we are.
if you literally, I mean, if you reread the second book,
That's all it's about. Okay, I'm going to go back and reread
all
it.
about compromise. And one of the points at the end of the book is the Russian says, if you're getting compromise, why would you only get it on one person? You'd get it on everybody, because then you control everybody. And that kind of is getting to what you're talking about. I think that if you can get your hands on all the emails, then you got a lot more on a lot more people. And I can't speak to what's really happened in real life, but it's certainly, what I try and do in these books is put out things that make sense. And if you are willing to use this for some political people, why would you stop at them? You wouldn't. And if you're in, and so, yeah, when you watch certain politicians act in truly bizarre ways, it certainly, I wonder too. We don't know. I'm not going to say it because I don't know, but it's certainly like there are some people who are so afraid to do anything but go along with Trump. It is downright bizarre.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. This was incredibly interesting, and I'm going to be excited to post it everywhere. So have a great day, and thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate it.